introduction, and thank you all so much for coming today to hear about my research. This is the first time I'm presenting this work to those outside my dissertation committee, so I really look forward to your comments and questions in the Q&A section. So before we take a journey back to the 1930s and everyday life in the most popular, some of the most popular political movements, I want to take us back to the 1980s to 1990s. This was a time when Lebanon and the Lebanese Civil War was one of the most thoroughly studied topics in the field of Middle Eastern studies. Most of these studies were authored by political scientists and historians that were trying to wrap their heads around the war, where at least 170,000 people perished. Now, regardless of their specific research questions or objectives, they all worked from the premise that the main agents of violence were popular organizations. These were social clubs, scout movements, and what were considered during the war, militias. Here's one quote from scholar Itamar Rabinovich in 1985 that I argue, as best as one quote can, represents the literature on popular organizations. He's talking about the Kataib here, one of the popular organizations we'll discuss today. The Kataib clearly was the single most important actor among Lebanon's Christians in the events leading to the crises. The party was established by Pierre Gemayel in the mid-1930s as a radical, vigilante youth movement in defense of the Lebanese entity. As its name suggests, the movement's original ideology and structure were influenced by ultranationalist and fascist models of the decade. The crises of the early 1970s show it in its original vigilante role. Now, this quote emphasizes two things that we need to know in the history of the Kataib, according to this author. The Christian sects of Lebanon as the Kataib's main base of support. That's the first thing. And the second is the Kataib's defensive Lebanese nationalist ideology. More specifically, this quote stresses the place of sect and ideology in determining the Kataib's role as an agent of violence in the Lebanese Civil War. Now, of course, this information is important, with the ideological claims and sectarian rhetoric of multiple parties to the war. But at the same time, this historiography on popular organizations makes it appear as if the divergent sectarian backgrounds and ideologies of various actors alone made the war inevitable. So if this was the focus of the 1980s and 1990s by political scientists and historians, what wasn't studied then? Here we have a blank application for the Kataib Party of the 1940s. On the front, it asks applicants to provide information about themselves and their family. And on the back, it explains how one is to become a member of the Kataib, both in Arabic and French. And here are the uniforms. I know this picture's not very good, but you can see here, hopefully, the uniforms of young boys in another rival popular organization, the Progressive Socialist Party. They're at a scout retreat in 1975, right before the war. They're bonding with their fellow members in circles, posing for pictures with party flags, and being trained by adult leaders. Now, what these types of sources help capture, that I argue an analysis of sect and ideology alone cannot, are the cultures that form around popular organizations, both inside and outside moments of conflict. In this talk, I argue that cultural practices like joining a group or wearing a uniform played a major role in constructing the identities of these types of groups. And because these practices are central to the histories of these organizations, I also argue that they can illuminate the study of conflict and violence in Lebanon. So this talk draws on research from the first chapter of my dissertation and focuses on everyday life in the early histories of three popular organizations. They are the Najade, the Kataib, and the Progressive Socialist Party. I am going to discuss three major cultural practices in these groups and use one group to highlight a certain practice and then draw connections when I find applicable. The three cultural practices I'm going to talk about today are one, becoming a member, and this deals with issues of belonging and the rituals around those. Second is what to do, wear, and sing, and these all deal with questions of style. And then third is memorializing violent events in the histories of these groups. Then I will end with some concluding remarks about these practices and what they can tell us about the participation of these three groups in later episodes of conflict. So before we delve into these cultural practices, I think it is best to provide a brief sketch of these three popular organizations. But the first question you're probably asking yourself is, what are popular organizations? This term refers to those groups in Lebanon developing in the 1930s to 1940s, during the French Mandate period and then also the beginning of the early independence period. They ranged in social form from scout organization to social justice movement, but collectively they were grassroots urban-based collectives, dominated by youth, often male members, and their leaders claimed to defend the people and popular demands, although these demands really vary from group to group. Now, I use this term for two main reasons. First is the most fitting English translation for the terms that these groups themselves actually evoke. Mundima, Shabiya, popular organization, or Harakat Shabiya. Second, it is used in order to consider these groups as more than just ideological-based political parties or armed groups that represent one sect or another. Now, this chart includes details about the three parties that we are going to explore today. First is the Nejadeh Party, which was founded by Muhyiddin Nasuli in 1937. He was a scout leader and was actually inspired by famous British scout leader Robert Baden-Powell. He actually also founded an organization before this called the Muslim Scouts in 1920. And he actually envisioned the Nejadeh as the third stage of scout life, and its members had to be 18 years or older. Its ideology was a prototypical Arab Islamic nationalism, favoring a geographic federal union, and its ranks were dominated by Sunni Muslims. Now, second is the Lebanese Kataeb Party, or Phalanx Party. Its founder, Pierre Gemayel, owned and managed a pharmacy in downtown Beirut in the 1930s. He was also a football enthusiast and the president of the Lebanese Football Federation. He founded the Kataeb in 1936 after returning from the Berlin Summer Olympic Games. He saw there many of Europe's youth organizations on display and wanted to instill the same sense of discipline in Lebanon's youth. Its ideology was a separate Lebanese nationalism dominated by Christians across sects, although the majority of members were Maronite Catholics. Now, the last group is the Progressive Socialist Party. It was founded by Kamal Jumblat, who was actually the only popular organization leader to come from a feudal elite background. He founded the party in 1949 at a time after World War II when many questioned the vitality of nationalist movements like these two popular organizations before him. He lectured about the protection of individual human rights through socialism with an emphasis on regional and international socialist alliances. His group largely represented the Druze sect of Lebanon. So with this background, the first practice to outline in the everyday life of these groups is how an individual actually becomes a member of these types of groups. And I'm going to use the Nejadeh as the focus here. Now, the first step in the process was actually filling out an application, like this one. A blank Nejadeh application of the 1940s for their Beirut regional office. An applicant was asked to provide basic personal information, their family name, their marital status, address, occupation, and level of education. And then they would turn in the application to their closest Nejadeh branch office, along with a 12 lira registration fee. Now, it's difficult to put an exact date on this application, but the registration fee of 12 lira could have been as steep as the price of basic staples like bread for up to a 4-month period, so a pretty steep registration fee. Another thing that stands out in this application is that it inquires, right about in the second half for those who read Arabic, what rank an applicant carried in the Muslim Scouts, the youth preparatory organization for the Nejadeh. So to be a member of the Muslim Scouts, it wasn't a requirement for new Nejadeh members, but it did carry a certain cultural capital. Troop leaders and party officials alike found it desirable to have members with prior experience in scout practices and activities. The next step in this process was a review of the applicant by the regional office. This process is detailed in a 1944 pamphlet entitled The Internal Organization for the Teams. It appears that this pamphlet was intended to prepare branch leaders to oversee the new member process. As outlined in the pamphlet, a committee of reviewers at the regional office would hold a session to judge the character of the applicant. If after the review, which could actually take up to 2 weeks, the region found nothing wrong with the applicant would assume the rank of a candidate. And as candidate, the individual had to attend all branch meetings for a month. At the end of that month, the candidate would then be administered a membership exam. It's not mentioned in this exact pamphlet what would be included in that test, but we do know from other popular organizations that membership tests were meant to measure knowledge of the group, its history, its ideology, its structure, and physical prowess through strength tests. If the individual passed the test, the branch would then hold a ceremony for the new member in the presence of the branch leadership. This ceremony was called a consecration party, Hefle Takris. So at the party, the new member would utter the Nejadeh oath, which is shown here on the left under Principle 49. That oath was, I swear by God the Great that I respect the Nejadeh organization and its goals, and I am attempting to work by its principles, faithfully and loyally, end quote. That goal, in the words of the Nejadeh founder Nasuli, was to be a good citizen with good morals. Those are his exact words. Thereafter, after saying this oath, the individual would receive the Nejadeh uniform and badge, thus becoming an official member. The picture on the right here is from a 1944 ceremony in which the outgoing Nejadeh leader is passing the party flag to the new leader. Now, obviously, this is more of a spectacle than a rank-and-file membership ceremony, but it still gives us an idea of what Nejadeh rituals actually looked like. Now, these types of applications, examinations, and rituals were not unique to the Nejadeh party. On the left is a blank application for the Kitab in the 1940s. It seeks basic personal information, like the Nejadeh application, but also inquires into the height, shoulder width, and most telling, the distinctive signs or features of the individual applicant. So while the Nejadeh leadership seemed most interested in scout experience, the Kitab was most interested in individual buff. This is reinforced by the military training exams that the new Kitab members had to take before participating in their first group festival, which was actually called a show. And on the right are the pictures of a 1958 Kitab oathing ceremony in the Mount Lebanon village of Hamana. Pierre Jamail is in the center of the picture there. He traveled to the branch. He stood by as members uttered the oath to the Lebanese homeland and to the Kitab, and met new members as they performed the Kitab salute or greeting. These members then celebrated their new belonging with music played by the Kitab Hamana branch band, as we see pictured below here. Now, in judging the centrality of membership rituals for popular organizations, terms like consecration and authentication seem most fitting. First, the process of application, review, examination, and the more performative practice of oathing consecrate the individual, passing group responsibilities to him and showing faith in his allegiance, his discipline, his ability. Second, and not unlike the process in early modern Europe whereby an apprentice became a part of a guild, this all placed the popular organization at the center of the member's life and authenticated that group as the claimant over the individual member. So in part this worked to sever the individual from other group affiliations, whether it was the state, the classroom, or the family. And it created a largely autonomous space for the cultivation of group identity. Now, as shown in the context of the Nejade, immediately after uttering the party oath and becoming an official member, the individual was given a uniform. So the next important aspect of everyday life and image making for these types of groups was a style, or a look. We're going to use the Kitab to explore three aspects of style: clothing, training, and singing. In terms of sources, we are now entering the realm of pictures. This is a picture of the distinct Kitab look donned by its leaders in 1936. They are wearing long sleeve, button-up shirts, ties, slacks, black, high around the waist, black shoes, and white stockings draped over the shoes. Now there's two things worth noticing here, if you can see. First, the man on the left here, he has his tie on backwards. What is most interesting about this is Charles Helou, who would become the president of Lebanon from 1964 to 1970. So he couldn't really tie a tie, but I guess he could serve as president, is kind of the idea. Okay? Now the second thing you might think here is that this uniform resembles those of fascist organizations in Europe during the 1930s to 1940s. Well, indeed it does, but we need to historicize this uniform. It was 1936, before World War II, and at the time, many nationalist youth organizations, both inside and outside Lebanon, used a distinct militaristic style to convey their sense of being: formal, ordered, discipline. And this clothing was also worn during party marches. Additional materials pictured here are the Lebanese Kataib flag with their Lebanese cedar logo. This march from the 1940s took place outside the Lebanese Parliament building, but it was actually illegal to march close to state buildings and public roads. According to Lebanese law at the time, this type of march was punishable by 1 to 3 years in jail. So while the risks were high in a sense, marching worked to produce a space in which the Kataib could literally practice its identity. Now this clothing was also worn at group festivals, as we can see from most of the men surrounding Pierre Jamel in the middle here. We also see the practice, the gesture of saluting here. The Kataib greeting, Tahiyya Kataibiyya. Right hand up, palm facing outward, fingers touching the right brow. The scouting and sporting uniform was somewhat different, with shorts and a short-sleeved shirt, perhaps even more similar to the Nazi youth uniform. But this was the type of clothing that was considered suitable for activity during Kataib scouting retreats, like the one pictured here. Activities on these retreats included football, nature walks, wrestling, running, jumping, cycling, and other forms of strength training. Now these pictures of the 1930s to 1940s demonstrate that marching, scouting, and sport were central to the Kataib style, which is the second aspect of their image, training, or what they called al-amal, which they translate as action. Now while camping or playing football were clearly a means for group leaders to tap into masculine youth activities of the time, they were also part and parcel of developing the collective identity of the Kataib. This identity was predicated on the young man's strength and discipline through physical action, as part of a community of strong young men. Now the third aspect of style and image making for the Kataib was party chants, or anthems. Lyrically, these chants represented a call to participation, reflected aspects of the group's ideology, and used imagery to claim their state as the guardians of the nation. Take, for instance, here the Kataib anthem. It's called Come On Kataib Youth, Hayya Fatah al-Kataib. The lyrics are translated into English here, and we'll listen to it here. lyrics here use lushness and fortifications to symbolize the Kateb defense of beautiful Lebanon. Moreover, it calls the male youth to participate in this defense and immersed in the parts. Come on, Kateb youth. But as historians of cultural practices, lyrics can only really get us so far. To investigate the style and sound of chants can give us a sense, albeit limited, of how anthems were internalized and received by ordinary members. Now, this anthem was influenced by the Lebanese national anthem, actually, and other marching music akin to that of Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries. But other trance, interestingly, mixed arabesque styles with militaristic tones. Take, for example, this chant, "On the rock we drill, O Kata'eb." Comparable to the classical Arabic tones popularized by artisans like Fairuz, although some later Kateb chants outside of our time period actually replicate these songs of Fairuz. Nonetheless, to combine local, familiar sounds, hear a drum with marching music and shouting, breathed a sense of discipline and order into existing youth cultures. In fact, singing, marching, and playing assured youth members that they didn't have to give up their hobbies. They just needed a more structured young adulthood. Now, perhaps what to wear, do, and sing was most important to a group like the Kateb, with their investment, some can say obsession perhaps, with the body, strength, and performances exhibiting physical prowess. Still, these aspects of style played a role in the making of other popular organizations as well. Take the Progressive Socialist Party here, for example. They're at a party festival in 1952, one much like that of the Kateb. Members are wearing white shirts, black suit jackets, and sometimes ties, often holding party flags. Now, this type of garb was meant to showcase their look, grounded in gentility and humbleness. Their songs, like the Kateb, were military anthems, but they were sometimes infused with arabesque sounds. Their lyrics about youth participation, strength, and defense, shown through such titles as The Popular Army, A Land, Peace to the Youth, or you could also translate as Peace of the Youth, and Pro of the Struggle. And these chants would be sung by adult and youth members alike at Progressive Socialist Party festivals and scouting camps. So the clothes worn, the drills performed, and the words shouted were some of the main components of everyday life in popular organizations. Thus, a style which really doesn't tell us much about the sect of a group was crucial in building the collective identity of these groups. Now, becoming a member and crafting a style were clearly aspects of everyday life in popular organizations. Another facet that I will not discuss today revolves around individual responsibilities, behaviors, and morals. More or less, how to act. But I would be happy to describe this type of practice during the Q&A. Another important cultural practice that may not have shaped everyday life as much, but was still linked to forming a group identity, was the memorialization of heroic behavior often linked to violent events. These events were often remembered in the form of pictures, statements, and festivals, which we can see in our remaining popular organization, the Progressive Socialist Party. They memorialize a specific event in 1951 when their members encountered state security forces, what they call the blood baptism, or El-Ma'mudiyya ad-Dam. While our focus today has been the practices of popular organizations, we must acknowledge that state officials, whether during the French Mandate period or later, were not just standing around as these groups were running around town. Especially in the 1930s to 1950s, state officials were struggling to craft their own cultural festivals for the sake of incorporating these groups into state machinery. So instead, they crafted laws and stipulations to monitor the behavior and impose penalties on these types of groups. In the case of the Progressive Socialist Party, they had been facing government repression since their founding in 1949, largely for their platforms, especially those against President Bishar al-Khoury. The group used their newly founded newspaper to critique the government and expose its corruption. Here's an example from an early edition of their newspaper, where Lebanon is depicted on the right here as a decrepit hut that needed remodeling. Alongside the following caption at the bottom, "The strength of the people will destroy this era towards liberation." Now, around this time, the party held a festival in a village of the Shul district of Mount Lebanon named Baun. The festival was meant to draw attention to a party campaign for upcoming parliamentary elections. This campaign was an attempt to change the makeup of the pro-Khoury parliament, and most importantly, represented the Progressive Socialist Party's first open challenge against the status quo. Police forces were dispatched to this festival in Baruch, and while the spark is still unknown, shots were fired, multiple people were injured, and one party member was killed. This episode became synonymous with what it meant to be a part of the Progressive Socialist Party, and this aspect of collective identity was conditioned through remembrance. Only a year after the blood baptism, or what is also called the Day of Baruch, party leader Kamal Jumblat wrote a column remembering the martyrs and how they gave future members a freedom of belief to challenge the government further, expose their crimes, and force the government to accept their party. This story was accompanied by a cartoon. And for those familiar, not with this cartoon, but it's eerily similar to the French paintings of the mid-19th century that depicted bloody revolution. So you hopefully can see here, as best as possible, the cartoon shows fallen martyrs on the ground, an individual lamenting on the right-hand side there. Gun salutes for the martyrs below, and a triumphant man on top of a mountain waving the party flag. Struggle and sacrifice are also epitomized in the headlines for this cartoon. They read, "The mountain of the day of Baruch melted in the heat of the tenderness and amazingness of martyrdom." Pick and pen, which is their party slogan. And the day of Baruch is our day, and in all days for our victory. Furthermore, this event is celebrated yearly, as we can see here, with an announcement for a festival in 1958. It is remembering the martyrs of Baruch. This festival included a lecture by Kamal Jumblat and words from other members of the party on the significance of the blood baptism. Now, the Progressive Socialist Party is not the only group to memorialize violence. The Kadab do the same for an earlier 1937 event, and guess what they call it? Their blood baptism, Al-Mahmudiyya ad-Dam. In November 1937, the Kadab were banned by the Lebanese Interior Ministry following the directive of High Commissioner of the French Mandate, Damien de Martel. They ordered the Kadab to dissolve for its so-called paramilitary character. Now, before hearing of the ban, the Kadab was planning a march to celebrate their one-year anniversary. They decided to defy the ban and congregate in downtown Beirut to protest their dissolution. Like with the Progressive Socialist Party blood baptism of 1951, the spark was unclear, but a clash ensued and spread across different neighborhoods of the city. The brawl was between Kadab members and supporters on one side, and Lebanese security forces and the French army on the other side. 2 Kataeb members were killed, and the Kataeb leader, Pierre Jamail, was bludgeoned to the head and sent to jail. He was eventually released due to public outcry, and his release, along with the official reinstatement of the Kataeb party, represented a popular victory against French imperialism and the Mandate. Even while still under French rule, although Vichy, not Republican rule at this point, the Kataeb memorialize this event. On November 21st, 1942, which is the 5th anniversary of the blood baptism, the Kataeb newspaper ran this picture of the clash. The leader, Pierre Jamail, can be found in the center. His arms are out like this. He's wearing a suit jacket and a tie. This picture became the party symbol, and it's included in various types of party productions, even in those of today. In 1942, though, the picture was printed alongside an article by Pierre Jamail. His words were actually quite ambiguous, which I was surprised to see. But this was most likely to avoid the ire of French censors at the time. Still, he acknowledged how the party passed through trials and tribulations, including the bloody ones, which he argued were, and this is a quote here, the cornerstone of the party's history. Even today, this event is remembered yearly with a festival. It is now more a celebration of the origination of the group that includes words on the blood baptism. This is identical to the way the Progressive Socialist Party embeds the 1951 blood baptism into their yearly Founders Festival. Now, during my field research in Beirut last fall, I had a chance to attend the Kataeb yearly festival. I saw young boys, girls, and adults waving party flags, wearing the new uniform of the Kataeb. On the right, as you can see, are often all black or khaki with combat boots. And they were also in the middle here with this huge stage singing party anthems. At this festival, Amin Jamail, who is the president of the Kataeb and son of Pierre Jamail, instructed Kataeb members that in the face of today's crises, whether the Syrian war or the issue of Hezbollah's arms, they must remember the day in 1937 when Pierre Jamail, the founder, shed blood in defense of the nation. Now to conclude, I have two main points I would like to make here, trying to make sense of all these forms of documents. First, while the ideologies and sect backgrounds of groups like the Nejade, the Kataeb, and Progressive Socialist Party are of course different, we find that whether it is the cultural practice of remembering violent events, the process of becoming a member, or issues dealing with party style, these three groups are strikingly similar. This leads to an important question. How then did an individual popular organization stand out among the field? To answer this question and analyze its implications as they relate to violence, I find it useful to bring in the concept of distinction, as described by Pierre Bourdieu in his 1979 work, Distinction, a Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste. Ordinary members, in their association to one party over another, did not stress nor realize these types of similarities that I highlighted today. Belonging in the form of beliefs, rituals, and styles work to foster their distinct ideologies and their distinct identities, which is what they stressed in their interactions between each other. Whether it was the Arab nationalism and moral citizenry of the Nejade, the Lebanese nationalism and strength-based nation of the Kataeb, or the regional socialism and anti-status quo struggles of the Progressive Socialist Party, these groups used cultural practices to emphasize their own identity, their own ideology. And here's the most important facet. This distinct identity, by its very nature, necessitated another in order to stand out. Now let's be clear, creating another is not hostile by its very nature. Instead, the process of boundary making was a means to create in-group solidification and justify group existence. In Bourdieu's study, it is the way in which art aficionados use the crude lay observer as their other, which works to create an elite in-group and justify the existence of a high art subculture. Now, in the world of popular organizations, let's take the Progressive Socialist Party, for example. Through their rituals and style, they often highlighted their group basis in the individual, his political action, and his gentility, guided by a moral understanding of human rights. This emphasis was in part to distinguish its ideology and its identity from other groups like the Najade and Gadaeb that stress the collective and its physical strength over the individual. So we see this process of in-group solidification across popular organizations. It's not unique to the Progressive Socialist Party. But distinction in the face of many similar cultural practices is so important in its extreme manifestations. Distinction, like all forms of othering that we experience in our daily lives, sets the potential for out-group antipathy and, in some cases, hatred and dehumanization of the other. This hatred can be amplified in the face of perceived threats, like those most prevalent in Lebanon during the social crises of the early 1970s, right before the Lebanese Civil War. The second concluding point regards the issue of violence and strength in the early histories of these organizations. First, the mere existence of retelling bloody sagas show that confrontation is ritualized and built into party consciousness. Leaders and members alike, they remember the events, they remember the individuals who died, and they appropriate the symbols of the past for contemporary crises, like was clear in the 2013 Qatar festival I attended. Through this type of ritual and the other strength-based practices we discussed today, violence, defense, and honor become embedded in organizational tenets and are not far from institutional memory. When this cultural history is combined with the process of distinction, as I just explained, and perceived threats, I argue that these tenets can work alongside sect and ideology to shift the nonviolent practices of these groups to violent ones. In other words, the mundane practices we talked about today, grounded in discipline and strength, are central to understanding the transformation from routine politics to collective violence. Now, in sum, while ideology and sect are surely a part of conflict in Lebanon and the Middle East, both historically and contemporarily, I argue that in order to gain a more nuanced picture of collective violence, we must contextualize that violence through the broader cultural practices of groups that participate in conflict. When we do this, studying things like membership rituals, party styles, and memorialization of violence, we actually work to bring the rank and file, the ordinary member, into the study of conflict. This approach, which does not depend solely on a description of a group's sect or its ideology, also helps to think beyond purely sectarian explanations of violence in the Middle East. So I thank you very much for listening to my talk, and I also want to thank the UVA-based units that helped fund my dissertation research. Sorry for the pixelation here, School of Middle Eastern North African Studies. First and foremost, the School of Middle Eastern North African Studies, the Confluence Center for Creative Inquiry, the Social and Behavior Sciences Research Institute, SBSRI at UA, and also GPSC, the Graduate and Professional Student Council at UA. So I'd like to thank them for funding my research, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.